They thought my shaking hands made me weak, that a little tremor meant my mind was gone, my worth erased, my voice silenced. But those same hands, they held a pen steady enough to end every plan they whispered about me. Hello, my name is Ida Grant, and I'm 72 years old. Before I begin, let me ask you, where are you watching from tonight? Whether it's your living room, your kitchen table, or somewhere far from family, I want you to listen closely. Because what happened to me isn't just my story, it's a warning. It began on an evening I should have cherished. Family dinners were once my anchor, the kind of nights that kept me tethered after my husband passed. When the house grew quiet and the walls echoed with nothing but the ticking of an old clock, those invitations from my son and daughter-in-law felt like a lifeline. That night, I put on my best blouse, navy blue, with pearl buttons that Arthur, my husband, always loved. My hands trembled as I fastened them, but not from weakness, from nerves. I still cared about appearances, still hoped my family cared enough to notice the effort. I wore my wedding band, even though Arthur had been gone nearly a decade. It felt like carrying him into the room with me. When I arrived, the house smelled of rosemary chicken and garlic bread. Warm, inviting. For a moment, I let myself believe it would be different this time. That maybe, just maybe, there would be kindness. The table was long, crowded with my son, his wife, and their 3 children. My daughter had come too, with her teenage twins. Laughter echoed from the end of the table, the kind of laughter that comes from wine glasses refilled too quickly. I smiled, easing into my seat. But the moment I lifted my fork, the first comment landed. "Careful, Mum," my son said lightly, though his eyes carried something sharper. "Don't spill." We just had the chairs cleaned, the table chuckled. My fork clinked against the plate. I steadied my hand, forcing it still, though the tremor betrayed me. "She can't even hold it straight," one of the teenagers whispered, not as quietly as he thought. "How's she supposed to sign checks?" More laughter. This time, from the adults. My daughter-in-law leaned toward my son, murmuring, "You'll have to take over sooner than we thought." The words sliced deeper than any knife. I tried to swallow, but the food turned to ash. My hands shook harder, not from age, but from humiliation. I placed them carefully in my lap, clasping them together, praying the tremor would stop. "I heard banks won't even accept signatures that messy," my daughter added with a smirk. Imagine her trying to write one of those big checks. The room erupted. Even my grandchildren, the ones I once rocked to sleep, giggled at their mother's cruel joke. I wanted to scream, to remind them of the nights I stayed awake balancing ledgers, of the decades Arthur and I spent paying bills on time, signing mortgages, covering medical costs, buying school supplies when they couldn't. But I said nothing. Instead, I pushed my chair back, slowly. The scrape against the hardwood silenced them for a beat. I stood, cane steady in my right hand. "Excuse me?" I said, my voice calm but clipped. "I think I've lost my appetite." No one followed me as I walked to the door. No one called after me. Outside, the night was cold. The stars blurred with tears I refused to let fall until I was alone. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel, the leather soft beneath my shaking hands. It wasn't just the laughter. It was the betrayal, the realization that to them, I was no longer a mother, no longer a provider, no longer even a person. I was a burden, a joke, a ticking clock they couldn't wait to run out. But as I sat there, one thought cut through the fog. They think I can't even sign a check. I let the words settle, heavy and bitter. And then, almost in defiance, a small smile touched my lips. Because they were wrong. Dead wrong. My hands might tremble, but they still worked. And soon enough, I would prove it. One signature at a time. When I got home that night, I couldn't bring myself to take off the blouse with the pearl buttons. It still carried the faint smell of rosemary and garlic, but now it clung with humiliation. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at my hands resting in my lap. They trembled, yes, but not without strength. Those hands had carried more than any of my children could ever understand. I remembered the first time I wrote a check. It was 1974, and Arthur and I had just bought our small two-bedroom house. The mortgage payment was due, and he was stuck working double shifts at the factory. He handed me the checkbook that morning, kissed my forehead, and said, "It's all yours, Ida. You've always been better with numbers than me." And I was. Month after month, I balanced the books, cut corners when we had to, and stretched every dollar until it nearly tore. When the factory went on strike, it was me who kept the lights on, writing checks late at night with a baby sleeping in the crib beside me. Those same hands packed lunches, sewed hems, and signed permission slips. They turned the pages of bedtime stories, bandaged, scraped knees, and one day, years later, signed tuition checks that made college possible for the same children who now mocked me. Arthur's illness came like a thief in the night. Cancer. By then, my hands weren't just tools, they were lifelines. I managed the endless hospital bills, filled out forms, signed release papers when he could no longer hold a pen. When his hands grew too weak to hold mine, mine never let go. And after he was gone, I carried it all alone. Property taxes, car repairs, even the down payment for my son's first home. I remember sitting at the bank with him, watching his face glow with pride while I signed the check. He never looked at my hand then, only at the numbers. Funny how quickly they forget. I stood and went to the dresser. In the top drawer was an old ledger book, the one I kept even after computers took over. Its pages were yellowed, but the ink still held strong. Every entry was neat, precise, written in my handwriting. I ran my fingers over the lines, proof that these hands had never failed me. That night, as I closed the book, I realized something important. While they saw weakness, I still held power. The bank accounts, the deeds, the savings bonds, tucked neatly in the safe. All of it was under my name. The will, mine to write. The accounts, mine to move. The future, mine to decide. They thought the tremor meant the end of my usefulness. But in truth, it was the beginning of their undoing. The next morning, I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the small stack of envelopes that arrived daily. Bills, statements, reminders. I opened one, my utility bill, and signed the check as carefully as I could. The signature wasn't perfect, a little jagged in places, but it was mine, and it cleared. That small act filled me with a surge of determination. If my children wanted to believe my worth ended with the steadiness of my hand, then I would teach them a lesson they'd never forget. I began to recall conversations I had overheard, the whispers when they thought I wasn't listening. My daughter once told her husband, "When Mum passes, at least we'll finally have money for the renovations." My son, not long after Arthur's funeral, had joked, "She's sitting on a gold mine and doesn't even know it." But I knew. I had always known. Arthur and I worked too hard to let our legacy rot in the hands of those who saw me as nothing more than a shaky inconvenience. I closed my eyes and remembered him clearly, his voice low and steady. "Don't ever let them push you aside, Ida. You've got more grit than all of them combined." That night at dinner, when they laughed at me, I almost forgot those words. Almost. But sitting in my kitchen, ledger book by my side and checkbook in front of me, I felt them again. His faith in me, his trust, his reminder. I whispered into the empty room, "Don't worry, Arthur. I won't let them win." It was time to act. But before I could, I had to decide. Was I willing to upend everything? To risk their anger, their bitterness, their inevitable retaliation? The answer came quicker than I expected. Yes. because they had already shown me what they thought of me. Now it was my turn to show them who I really was. And I would start with a pen. The morning after that sleepless night, I shuffled into the living room with my cane, sat by the window, and watched the world outside move on as if nothing had happened. Birds landed on the feeder Arthur built, pecking happily, unaware of the storm that brewed in my chest. But inside me, something had shifted. Their laughter still rang in my ears, mocking, dismissive, smug. It was no longer just humiliation I felt. It was clarity. They had shown me their true hearts, and I couldn't unsee it. Later that week, I stopped by my son's house to drop off a box of old family photos. I rang the doorbell, but no one came. I almost left the box on the porch until I heard voices drifting from the kitchen window left ajar. At first, I told myself not to listen, but then I heard my name. "She can't even hold a pen anymore," my daughter-in-law sneered. "You saw her at dinner. Honestly, you should start looking into nursing homes." My breath caught in my throat. Then my son replied, voice low but filled with certainty. "Don't worry. When she's gone, it'll all come to us anyway. The house, the accounts, everything. We just have to be patient." They laughed together, the same cruel laughter that had echoed around the dinner table. I backed away from the window, clutching the box so tight the cardboard edges bit into my hands. I wanted to burst in, confront them, scream until my voice broke. But I didn't. Instead, I walked back to my car, drove home, and sat in silence. That was the moment I knew. They weren't just careless with their words. They were already planning a future without me, one that depended entirely on my death. Well, if they were waiting for me to hand them everything, I would give them something else instead. The very next morning, I dressed carefully. Grey slacks, a pressed blouse, and the good shoes I saved for church. I took my cane and my handbag, and I went to the bank. The teller looked up and smiled politely, though her eyes flickered briefly to my shaking hand as I slid my account book across the counter. I could feel her doubt, just like my family's. But I lifted my chin. "I'd like to speak with the manager, please," I said, my voice steady. A few minutes later, I sat in a small office with Mr. Lambert, the same manager who had known Arthur and me for decades. His hair had thinned, his glasses were thicker, but his handshake was familiar. "Mrs. Grant," he said kindly. "What can I do for you today?" I took a breath. "I want to make some changes." Quietly, his eyebrows lifted. I leaned forward, lowering my voice. "I'd like to consolidate my accounts and move certain funds into places where, let's just say, they'll be better protected." To his credit, he didn't question my motives. Perhaps he sensed the steel beneath my words. Perhaps he remembered the years Arthur and I had walked in together, signing loans and deposits without fail. Either way, he nodded. We spent nearly 2 hours going through details. By the time I left, I had opened a new private account, transferred substantial funds, and arranged for certain bonds to be placed in a trust that would bypass my children entirely. Walking out of that bank, cane tapping against the floor, I felt lighter than I had in years. My hands trembled. Yes, but with purpose, not weakness. That night, I sat at the kitchen, table, papers spread around me. My lawyer, an old friend named Samuel Pierce, would meet me the next day to discuss updating my will. Samuel had always respected me, never once treating me like a fragile relic. When I called, he said simply, "Ida, I'll bring the papers. You just bring your resolve." Resolve was the one thing I had plenty of. I thought about my grandchildren. A part of me ached for them, especially the youngest. They were still so easily influenced by their parents' cruelty. But I also knew that if I left everything untouched, those same parents would squander every dime. No, this wasn't about revenge alone. This was about justice. about making sure the life Arthur and I built didn't rot in greedy hands. I whispered into the empty kitchen, as though Arthur were sitting across from me with his old cup of coffee. They think I'm finished, but they've underestimated me. And as I stacked the documents neatly, I realized something. My hands might shake, but my signature was about to become the most powerful weapon I had ever wielded. The papers were spread before me like a battlefield. Legal documents, account summaries, the freshly updated draft of my will, all laid out in neat stacks across the kitchen table. My pen sat on top of the checkbook, small and unassuming, yet heavier than any sword. I stared at it for a long while. My hands trembled, as they always did, the tremor more noticeable when I was tired or anxious. If my children had seen me then, they would have smirked, whispered about frailty, laughed about the futility of an old woman clinging to her independence. But they weren't here. Only me, my pen, and the memory of Arthur's voice. "You've always been stronger than you know, Ida." I reached for the pen. The tremor made the motion imperfect, but I gripped it tight, pressing the point to the paper. My heart hammered in my chest, louder than the ticking clock on the wall. Slowly, carefully, I wrote out the amount, one that would drain my primary account into the new one I'd opened with Mr. Lambert's help. The pen scratched across the paper. My signature followed, jagged but unmistakable. Ida M. Grant. For a moment I couldn't breathe. When I lifted the pen, the ink glistened. Proof of my decision. Proof that my hands still worked. Proof that I wasn't powerless. I leaned back in my chair and let out a shaky laugh. They mocked me for being unable to sign a check, and yet here I was, signing one that would change everything. The next morning, I walked into the bank with my cane tapping confidently against the tile. The teller accepted the check, eyes widening slightly at the amount. She glanced at me, as though expecting hesitation, but I only smiled. "It's mine," I said calmly. "Every cent." And it was. For decades, I'd poured every ounce of myself into building that security. If anyone had the right to decide its fate, it was me. By the time I left, the transfer was complete. The money sat safe in my private account, away from the greedy hands of children who saw me as nothing more than a broken old woman. That evening, I sat once again at my table, pen in hand. This time, it wasn't just about the money. Samuel, my lawyer, had prepared the final draft of the will. He laid it in front of me with quiet reverence, as though he knew the weight of the moment. "Take your time," he said gently. But I didn't need time. I knew exactly what I wanted. Line by line, I read the document. Each word was deliberate, each clause ironclad. My children would receive only small conditional allowances, enough to keep appearances civil, but not enough to indulge their greed. The bulk of the estate would go to a trust for education scholarships in Arthur's name, to the community library that had carried me through years of lonely widowhood, and to a local shelter I had quietly supported for years. For my grandchildren, I left guarded trusts. They would benefit when they came of age, but the accounts would remain sealed until then, safe from their parents' grasp. When I reached the final page, I pressed the pen once more to paper. The tremor was there, but I let it flow through me. This wasn't weakness. It was proof of the years I had lived, the struggles I had endured, the strength it took to come this far. I signed my name. Ida M. Grant. Samuel looked at the paper, then at me. He gave a small nod. "It's done. They can contest it all they like. It won't stand." I exhaled slowly, relief washing over me like a tide. For the first time in years, I felt in control, not a relic waiting for the end, but a woman who had chosen her own ending. Later that night, I sat with a cup of tea and allowed myself a small smile. My children thought I was powerless, but I had just signed away their future with the same hands they mocked. As I closed my eyes, I could almost hear Arthur's chuckle in the room with me. "That's my Ida," he would have said, and for the first time since he left this world, I felt like I had honored him, not by clinging to what we built, but by protecting it from those who never deserved it. The check had been signed. The accounts were emptied. The stage was set. All that remained was to wait for the day they would gather, smug and certain, ready to inherit. And on that day, their faces would tell me everything I needed to know. The weeks that followed were quiet. Too quiet, almost. My children assumed life would roll on as always, with me slowly fading into the background, until one day the phone call came. She's gone. I let them believe it. I went to church on Sundays, walked slowly with my cane to the pew where Arthur and I used to sit. I bought groceries, waved politely to neighbours, and watered the plants on my porch. Outwardly, nothing had changed, but inside, everything had. The accounts were shifted. The deeds were re-signed. The will was sealed in Samuel's care, stamped with legal authority that not even the most bitter child could unravel. My future and Arthur's legacy no longer lay in their greedy hands. It was only a matter of time before they discovered it. That time came sooner than expected. A health scare, a fainting spell at home, landed me in the hospital overnight. My son rushed in, not out of love, but with the gleam of opportunity in his eyes. He asked questions about my health with a little too much eagerness, lingered by my bedside just a little too long, as though gauging how close the end might be. I played along. I smiled faintly, held his hand, and said, "Don't worry, everything is in order." He squeezed my hand, thinking it was reassurance. He didn't realize it was a warning. Not long after, the inevitable happened. The family gathered in Samuel's office for the reading of my will. The room was cramped with bodies and buzzing with expectation. My son sat tall, his wife perched beside him like a hawk guarding prey. My daughter crossed her legs, her lips already curved in a victorious smile. Even the grandchildren were there, slouched in their chairs, fiddling with phones as though the fortune about to drop in their laps was already theirs to spend. Samuel entered quietly, carrying a thick folder. He laid it on the polished oak table and adjusted his glasses. The chatter dimmed. Anticipation thickened the air. "Thank you all for coming," Samuel began. His voice was steady, professional. "As executor of Mrs. Ida Grant's estate, it is my duty to read her final will and testament." My children leaned forward. Their eyes glittered. Samuel opened the folder and began. His words fell like stones into water, sending ripples of disbelief across their faces. "To my son and daughter," he read, "you will each receive a modest inheritance to be used responsibly. However, the majority of my estate has been transferred into charitable trusts, scholarship funds, and community programs, bearing the name of my late husband, Arthur Grant." Gasps filled the room. My son's mouth fell open. My daughter's smile froze, her knuckles tightening around the arm of her chair. Samuel continued, unflinching. "My grandchildren are provided for through educational trusts, which will remain inaccessible until they reach adulthood. These funds are protected by law and cannot be accessed by their parents under any circumstance." A stunned silence followed, broken only by the ticking clock on the wall. Finally, my daughter-in-law found her voice. This can't be right." She wouldn't do this to her own family. Samuel looked at her over the rim of his glasses. "Mrs. Grant was very clear in her wishes. Everything here has been signed, witnessed, and notarized. It will hold." My son's face flushed crimson. He slammed his palm on the table. "She's lost her mind. She was barely holding a pen. How can this stand in court?" Samuel calmly lifted a second folder. "Because we recorded the signing." Mrs. Grant, though her hands shook, was of sound mind and body. She made her decisions freely, and every signature matches her legal record. Contest it, if you like, but I assure you, it will not succeed. My daughter's voice cracked as she leaned forward. So, we get scraps? After everything we've done for her? Done for me? The words rang bitter in my ears. I thought of the dinner table, the laughter, the whispered plans outside the kitchen window, and I almost pitied them. Almost. Because the truth was, they hadn't done anything for me in years. They had taken, expected, assumed, and now, for the first time, they were facing a future without my hand feeding theirs. The room dissolved into chaos. Angry voices, accusations, fists slamming against polished wood. But Samuel's calm presence anchored it all. He read the final clause of my will, his voice clear. To my children who mocked my hands and doubted my strength, may you remember that trembling hands can still hold power. And they held the pen that wrote this. The words silenced them. My letter, my voice, spoken through Samuel, landed heavier than any dollar amount could. Their faces drained of colour. My daughter-in-law clutched at her husband's arm, her lips pale. My son leaned back, his jaw tight, his pride wounded deeper than his pocket. The fortune they believed was theirs had slipped away, signed away by the very hands they mocked. And for the first time in years, I felt free. The room was thick with tension. Papers rustled, chairs scraped, but no one dared leave. My children sat stiff and pale, their dreams of easy wealth crumbling before their eyes. Samuel cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses as he pulled out one final envelope. This, he said, tapping the paper lightly, is a personal letter Mrs. Grant asked me to read aloud after the will. The murmurs ceased. Even the grandchildren looked up from their phones, curiosity outweighing boredom. Samuel unfolded the letter carefully, the pages crackling as though they carried the weight of every year I had lived. And then, in the quiet of that office, my voice returned. To my children, who once held my hands when they were small, their eyes widened. I remember when those hands of mine tied your shoes, wiped your tears, and carried you through storms you were too young to understand. I remember holding your fingers as you learned to walk, as you scribbled your first shaky letters. My hands were steady then, weren't they? Steady enough to feed you, to clothe you, to pay every bill that kept a roof over our heads. My daughter shifted uncomfortably, her lips pressing thin. But time changes all things. My hands shake now, yes, but tremors do not erase a lifetime of strength. They do not erase the nights I stayed awake balancing ledgers, or the mornings I signed checks so you could go to school. They do not erase the years I worked when your father fell ill, when I signed away piece after piece of my own comfort to keep you safe. Samuel's voice didn't waver, but I could see my son's jaw clench, his knuckles whitening against the table. And yet, at that dinner table, I heard you laugh. I heard you whisper that I couldn't even sign a check. You thought my trembling meant weakness. You thought my time had passed, that my mind had faded. You thought wrong. A silence fell so sharp, I imagined they could hear their own guilt pounding in their ears. I had written the letter carefully, every word a blade honed on years of sacrifice and betrayal. I signed one last check, not for you, but for myself. I signed away the future you thought was guaranteed. I placed it in hands that will honor it, in scholarships for children who work hard, in libraries where young minds find hope, in shelters that feed those who have nothing. My fortune will serve those who need it, not those who mocked the hands that earned it. My daughter-in-law gasped quietly, her hand flying to her mouth. To my grandchildren, if you are listening, know this. I did not punish you. I protected you. Your education will be safe, guarded until you are ready to stand on your own. If you choose kindness, if you choose integrity, you will thrive without ever needing to belittle another soul. The teenagers exchanged uneasy glances. The weight of my words pressed heavier than any inheritance ever could. And to my children, my blood, remember this truth. Trembling hands can still sign a name, and mine signed away your entitlement, not out of cruelty, out of justice, out of the hope that one day you will understand the difference between inheritance and legacy. Inheritance is what you take. Legacy is what you leave. Samuel folded the letter slowly, laying it on the table like a verdict. The silence that followed was suffocating. My son's face was drained of colour, his pride shattered in front of his wife and children. My daughter sat frozen, eyes glassy, as though the weight of every memory she had buried came crashing down. One of the grandchildren, the youngest, no older than 12, looked down at the floor, ashamed. In that moment, I hoped maybe, just maybe, the seed of understanding had been planted. Finally, my son broke the silence, his voice tight with rage. She did this to punish us. She destroyed the family. Samuel shook his head firmly. No, Mr. Grant. She made a choice that was entirely hers to make. The truth cut deeper than any accusation. They hadn't been robbed. They had been judged, and the judgment was final. As the room erupted again, raised voices, angry accusations, bitter tears, I imagined myself sitting in the corner, cane resting against my knee, watching it all unfold with quiet dignity. For years, they had underestimated me. They thought I was powerless. But in the end, it was my signature, shaky, imperfect, but indelible, that wrote the final chapter. And their faces, pale and stricken as Samuel closed the folder, were proof enough. I had won. When I walked out of Samuel's office that day, the air felt lighter than it had in years. My children stayed behind, their voices rising in anger, demanding answers from a lawyer who had none to give them. I didn't need to hear the rest. I had already heard enough in their whispers, in their laughter, in the careless way they dismissed me at that dinner table. As I stepped outside, the sun hit my face. I paused, closed my eyes, and breathed. For once, I wasn't carrying the weight of their expectations. I wasn't the old woman they pitied, the shaky hands they mocked. I was myself again, Ida Grant, the woman who had worked, sacrificed, and chosen her own legacy. That night, I sat in my quiet kitchen, the pearl-button blouse folded neatly in my dresser. I poured myself a cup of tea and let the steam curl around me. My hands trembled as I lifted it, but I no longer cursed the tremor. It was a part of me, a reminder of years lived, battles fought, burdens carried. They thought shaking hands meant weakness. They never understood it meant endurance. I thought of Arthur, of the long road we walked together, of the sacrifices we both made. I whispered into the empty room. I did it, Arthur. They'll never squander what we built. It will mean something. And though the house was silent, I felt as though he was smiling back. I know some may think I was harsh, that I should have forgiven, that blood should count for more. But let me ask you, what is family, if not respect? What is legacy, if not honor? My children mocked me. They saw me as a burden. So I showed them the truth. Trembling hands can still sign power into motion. So if you're listening to my story tonight, let it remind you. Never underestimate your own strength. Never let anyone else decide your worth. And tell me, before you go, where are you watching from? Because wherever you are, I hope you carry this lesson with you. Weakness is only what others call you. Strength is what you choose to be.